Public Nemesis Media.
Кај вас имаше една теза која беше приемена во парламентот до 45-та година. Сите се българи, 45-та година со декрет сите станува македонци и има македонски јазик. Таа теза е многу груба, многу лоша. Значи, според мене, јас сум еден од ретките македонци кој ќе ви каже дека да, според сето она што го анализирам и сето тоа што го читам, јасно е дека македонската нација излегува од българската, ама во еден долг процес, не 45-та. Значи има многу сериозен процес.
When it comes to the Macedonian nation, there are two different mainstream narratives. On one side, you have a narrative that tries to show the Macedonian nation as the oldest nation on the planet without any connections with their neighbors. Very untrue. On the other hand, you have a narrative that tries to show the Macedonian nation as a forced artificial creation whose existence is nothing more than a result of Tito's brainwashing. Also very untrue. In recent years, another narrative started getting traction, which tries to explain the Macedonian ethnogenesis as a complex historical process that started with the 1878 Berlin Congress. A good number of people, myself included, accept this objective historical viewpoint because they realize that the Macedonian nation didn't pop out of nowhere or was magically created overnight. Although this theory started getting recognition in recent years, it's not a new theory. On the contrary, this theory is 90 years old and was made by Bulgarian communists. The beginning of our story is this channel's standard by now. 1934 starts, the Comintern adopts a resolution with which they recognize a separate Macedonian nation, and both the resolution and the Macedonian nation were accepted by the Bulgarian Communist Party. In order to understand the story, we firstly have to understand why Bulgarian communists recognized a separate Macedonian nation in the first place. When the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization was re-established after the end of World War I, every Macedonian in that organization, regardless of their political ideology, agreed that the only solution for their freedom was a united and independent Macedonia. Achieving such goal would be insanely difficult, since Macedonia was divided through war and then occupied. Bulgarian communists were overly critical of the 1910s wars and the tearing apart of Macedonia. They believed that peace in the Balkans could only come by establishing a Balkan federation with Macedonia as its federal unit. To put it simply, they supported the wish of Macedonians for their self-determination, a state that shouldn't be controlled by the countries that conquered it, but by the people living in it. To show you what I mean, I'll quote the leader of the Bulgarian Communist Party, Georgi Dimitrov. In his speech at the National Assembly on December 25, 1945, Dimitrov said, "The foreign policy of the Fatherland Front is the real national Bulgarian policy. It comes from the real national interests of Bulgaria. It takes care about the bitter experience from the past, when the Macedonian question was exploited by foreign imperialists and their Balkan agents from the circles of ruling cliques, so that the Bulgarians would confront Serbs and Serbs confront Bulgarians. The Fatherland Front believes that we must do everything necessary to stop Macedonia from being the apple of discord in the Balkans once and for all, for it to become the link of unification between Bulgarians and Serbs, between the new Bulgaria and the new Yugoslavia. Not dividing Macedonia, not battle for its conquest, but respecting the will of Macedonians, whose basic part has received their national freedom and national equality within the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia." What a lot of people don't realize is that the very concept of a separate Macedonian nation is a form of self-determination. Even during Ottoman rule, the people who wanted a Macedonian state felt first and foremost as Macedonians. Considering that the fight to create such state preceded the Comintern resolution by at least 40 years, and that every Macedonian, from far left to far right, realized after World War I that their freedom can come only with an independent Macedonia, It's no wonder that many Bulgarians and Vlachs from Macedonia evolved into ethnic Macedonians. Despite not being a communist, I praised the Bulgarian Communist Party many times on my channel for their Macedonian policy. They didn't want to divide the already divided people, but instead were the only ones who saw the direction taken by the Macedonian ethnogenesis and decided to work with that process rather than against it. I would also go as far as to say that the Bulgarian communists had the best view of the Macedonian nation itself. Now, things get a little confusing because there were two different communist views. I made a video talking about the different views. You may want to watch it in order to make this topic easier for you to understand. But if you already had watched it, you may remember how I made a distinction between Macedonian communists from Imre United and Bulgarian communists from the Bulgarian Communist Party. I generalized, but that's in order to showcase the two different viewpoints. One from Imre United that explained the Macedonian nation as originating from the first Slavic tribes that settled in Macedonia, and the other from the Bulgarian Communist Party that explained the Macedonian nation as a young nation that separated from the larger Bulgarian nation. Once again, I generalized for the sake of simplicity when I differed Macedonian communists and Bulgarian communists. Every Imre United member was automatically a member of the Bulgarian Communist Party, and many Bulgarian communists who viewed the Macedonian nation as an outgrowth from the Bulgarian nation, such as the people we'll talk about in this video, were either born in Macedonia or had parents and grandparents from Macedonia. So there's one great article titled Macedonian Literary Circle written by Petar Galchin for Makedonski Pregled in 2002, which I actually quoted a few times in my videos. This time we're going to quote parts of it that talk about the Bulgarian communist viewpoint on Macedonians. Firstly, we have Hristo Kapakčiev, who explained the Macedonian nation as a result of the wars on the Balkans from 1912 to 1918, the bitter experience from those wars and the national oppression that succeeded the Balkan armed conflicts. All those factors made Macedonians head towards one thing: the right and possibility to declare their nationality themselves and to conquer their independence as a separate Macedonian nation. Then we have Vladimir Poptomov, who held a speech in Sofia's assembly in October of 1944. Here's what Poptomov said in his speech. Was it true that the Macedonian people were Bulgarian? I would say it is true. In many ways it is true. The Macedonian people are very close to the Bulgarian people, both in terms of language and tribe. After he said that, somebody from the crowd objected, but Poptomov doubled down his legitimate claim with the following words. If San Stefano, Bulgaria, for which the Russians shed so much blood, the blood of 200,000 people, was realized, and it included Macedonia in Bulgaria, then there would be no talk of a Macedonian people at all, because of language, as well both in struggles and in its historical past, it is infinitely close to the Bulgarian people. Galchin's article also mentions notes on a conversation between Georgi Dimitrov and Dimitar Vlahov on the Macedonian question, which showed that Dimitrov viewed Macedonia as populated with both Macedonians and Bulgarians. What this means is that he recognized the Macedonian ethnogenesis and many people feeling as just Macedonians, especially the younger generations, but also knew that things weren't black and white and that some Slavs in Macedonia still had a Bulgarian ethnic conscience. Another man who realized that was Todor Pavlov, a highly ranked member of the Bulgarian Communist Party. Petar Galchin mentions Pavlov's 1939 critique of the poetry made by Venko Markovski, a then Macedonist who wrote his poetry in the not yet standardized Macedonian language. Although he supported Markovski, Todor Pavlov expressed strongly his warning that the new Macedonian language must not be used as an argument for denying the historical merits and patriotism of many Macedonian revolutionaries, all of whom lived and died as Macedonian Bulgarians. Pavlov then wrote, I quote, "The fact that a huge mass of Macedonian revolutionary activists felt and continue to feel as Macedonian Bulgarians does not mean in the least that they are bad Macedonian patriots and bad fighters for the self-determination of Macedonia. It is enough for them to be aware that they are precisely Macedonian Bulgarians. It is enough that they were permeated by Goethe's ideas for an independent Macedonia and a national organization and struggle of all, without exception, oppressed, enslaved, and exploited peoples and minorities in Macedonia. It is enough for them to have a realistic, sober, and broader view of the economic and political conditions and perspectives of the Macedonian people's liberation struggle. All this is enough for healthy, progressive Macedonian patriotism to be born and strengthened in their souls. And this very healthy and progressive Macedonian patriotism, regardless of whether the individual Macedonian is called a Macedonian Bulgarian or a Macedonian Slav, is a sufficient reason for the work of the young Macedonian poet to be met enthusiastically. In a nutshell, Bulgarian communists told Macedonians, "We recognize your separation into your own nation and we support you guys becoming your own nation. Just respect the Bulgarian identity of your heroes and anyone in Macedonia who still has that conscience." Funny how that narrative is going on to this day. Considering how much help and support they gave to Macedonians and how that can bring the two peoples closer while maintaining the historical truth that the Slavic population of Macedonia was Bulgarian, I'm positive that today's Bulgarians won't have any problems from discussing this topic. If all of this is still not convincing to you, then let me tell you that the Bulgarian communists were big opponents of Macedonism. In my previous videos, I talked about the Macedonist doctrine and how the historiography that claimed Macedonian Slavs were never Bulgarians was created and developed. Believe it or not, Bulgarian communists were against such historical falsifications. That led to conflicts between Macedonists and communist Bulgarians even before they took power. Here's a funny situation described in the 1944 booklet, The Ethnographic Idea of Macedonian Slavs. You may recall its author, Angel Dinev. He was talked about on this channel many times because he was a top-tier Macedonist during 1930s and 1940s. In the year of 1940, Dinev was arrested and sent to a prison camp because of his communist activities. In that prison camp, he met many Bulgarian communists imprisoned for the same reason and proceeded to start a discussion with them on the Macedonian question. Dinev was upset because Bulgarian communists there viewed Macedonians as Bulgarians. After a long heated discussion, the majority of the imprisoned Bulgarian communists have accepted a separate Macedonian nation because they were explained to that Macedonians have their own geographical, ethnographic, revolutionary, political, and other national elements. But guess what? Dinev was still upset. Why, you ask? Because those Bulgarian prisoners did not understand the Macedonian nation the way he wanted them to. Communist Bulgarians viewed the Slavic population of Macedonia as Macedonian Bulgarians. However, now they're converting into a separate Macedonian ethnic group with a political goal. Angel Dinev wanted them to understand the Macedonian nation as a group of people that were always separate from Bulgarians because, apparently, as he wrote, the greater Bulgarians will use the conversion of Macedonian Bulgarians into Macedonians as an argument to convert Macedonians back into Bulgarians. It's sort of like how modern Macedonists say that admitting any common past with Bulgarians will magically Bulgarize them all and lead to them becoming assimilated. That could explain why Angel Dinev wrote all those books with Macedonia's historical narratives, but then again, He himself wrote books and articles before becoming a Macedonist that clearly referenced Bulgarians in Macedonia. Did he simply forget about that or hope that nobody would find out? Anyways, to stay on topic, this irrational fear was present after the end of World War II. If anything, it was even more noticeable. In 1946, Angel Dinev wrote an article for the Dobrovolets newspaper titled Poisonous Snake in the Macedonian Scientific Institute, which was actually an angry response to another article titled What Did Socialist Thought Contribute to the Macedonian Revolutionary Movement, written for Makedonska Misl by Angel Tomov. What was so horrible in that article that pissed off Dinev so much he wrote an entire response article? Tomov wrote that Macedonians had a Bulgarian conscience in the early years of the Macedonian Revolutionary Movement. For the record, Tomov's article itself is very critical towards the Bulgarian bourgeoisie, the Greater Bulgarian policy, the Bulgarian Tsars, all the stuff that communists viewed as enemies of Macedonians. Yet this one single sentence that mentioned how Macedonian Slavs had a Bulgarian conscience back in the day made Macedonists flip out. That was just one battle in a forgotten ideological war from 1934 to 1948 between Macedonists and anyone they deemed to be Greater Bulgarian chauvinists. And believe me, you could be cool with the existence of the Macedonian nation, language, and state if you dared to point out the Bulgarian origins of Macedonians. You would be labeled as a Greater Bulgarian. I'm serious, there was a huge internal conflict within the Bulgarian Communist Party on whether Macedonians separated from the Bulgarian nation or will always separate from Bulgarians. That internal conflict could be seen in the speeches and discussions in the Macedonian Scientific Institute. For example, you had a speech from January 18, 1947 by Mikhail Smatrkalev, a Macedonist. During his speech, Smatrkalev would a few times get in arguments with the already mentioned Angel Tomov. Tomov would point out multiple times the Bulgarian identity of the Slavs in Macedonia before the 20th century, to which Smatrkalev would respond with, "That doesn't matter," or the Bulgarian didn't refer to ethnicity. Funny how such arguing between Macedonians and Bulgarians are happening even today. Things get even more insane. I don't think there's better evidence of the internal conflict within the Bulgarian Communist Party existing at one point than this infamous document. In case you don't know what this is, it's a document created by the Ministry of Public Education titled Corrections in History Textbooks. The purpose was to remove the mistakes in history textbooks created after 1944 that were typical for Greater Bulgarian chauvinism. For example, Tsar Samuel's empire should not be taught as a Western Bulgarian empire, but as an empire of Macedonian Slavs. Another example, the Miladinov brothers, as well as other writers from Macedonia, should not be taught as a part of Bulgarian education. Surprise, surprise, the mastermind behind that document was a Macedonist. His name was Tushe Vlahov, and he was a member of Emira United, Dimitar Vlahov's nephew, and the then main inspector for history in the Ministry of Education. If anybody knows who this Pozaimov guy is, please comment down below. Now, this document is somewhat known among Bulgarians and Macedonians, but not many of them know why it was created in the first place. You see, during the cultural autonomy era, people in Macedonia had both Bulgarian history and Macedonian history as subjects in schools. Because both had some parts of history, like Tsar Samuel and the Miladinov brothers, the document was meant to create a clear division between the two school subjects. Basically, history that happened on Macedonia's territory was to be removed from Bulgarian history and to be learned about in Macedonian history class. To explain this chaos in greater detail, I'll quote Ivan Katargiev's biography of Vasil Ivanovski, a pioneer Macedonist who was fiercely fighting in Bulgaria against the appropriation of Macedonian history by Bulgarian science. He was critical towards what he called the two-faced policy of the Bulgarian Communist Party in Pirin, Macedonia. On one side, the students in Pirin, Macedonia studied Bulgarian history where the Macedonian people don't exist and the past of Macedonia is Bulgarian, while on the other side, they studied Macedonian history where Macedonians not only exist as a separate people, but as people with their own unique history. Then Ivanovski mentioned how the Central Committee of the Bulgarian Communist Party recognized the Macedonian nation and the People's Republic of Macedonia, but some of its members viewed Macedonians as a nation without a past, i.e., without a long historical process behind it. In other words, the Bulgarian Communist Party viewed Macedonians as a nation formed because, after Bulgaria's liberation, Macedonia stayed under Turkish rule. Until that era in history, the Macedonian Slavs were Bulgarians. Ivanovski would then mention the names of people with those views, and those include Vladimir Poptomov, who expressed such views when he came to Sofia from Moscow and wasn't criticized at all, Tito-Stalin, whose views like that could be heard in his lecture of the history of the Bulgarian Communist Party, Vasil Kolarov, where those views were heard in his speech on the 70th anniversary of Bulgaria's liberation, and Vilko Chervenkov, who dismissed any complaint made by Macedonians towards the Bulgarian Communist Party and their views on Macedonian history. That wasn't the only time Vasil Ivanovski had a history-based conflict with Bulgarian communists. In 1946, a brochure he wrote titled "The Current Questions on Macedonia" was published. Before that brochure was printed, the leader of the Bulgarian Communist Party and Bulgaria's president, Georgi Dimitrov, sent a copy of its text to Vladimir Poptomov for a review. Poptomov wrote a letter back to Dimitrov in which he wrote that Ivanovski's brochure was full of great information that could be useful to spread among the people, hence why it could be printed in many copies as long as some corrections are made. As you can already guess, the corrections were needed for the parts of the brochure dealing with Macedonian history, or as Vladimir Poptomov wrote, the author's distant trips into the past, taken in order to justify the existence of the Macedonian nation. Before we get to Poptomov's stellar analysis of the Macedonian ethnogenesis, it's worth mentioning that he denied the negative influence of the Bulgarian exarchate to Macedonians, which was an accusation Macedonians like Ivanovski had. Vladimir Poptomov debunked that accusation with these words in the letter. The exarchate is a great achievement of that great struggle, which the awakening Slavic population in European Turkey came out under the banner of Bulgarianness against the Greek spiritual slavery, threatening with the final Hellenization of the Slavic element. Without these struggles and without the further revival activity of the exarchate, there would hardly be a Slavic population left in Macedonia, and it would hardly be possible to speak of a Macedonian state and a Macedonian people today. That the Slavic population in European Turkey, even before the liberation of Bulgaria, led a struggle for ecclesiastical independence against the Greeks under the banner of Bulgarianness is a historical fact. It is also a historical fact that Imro of Goce-Delchev and all other leaders of the Macedonian liberation movement was an organization covering mainly Macedonian Bulgarians, who shouldered the revolutionary struggle against Turkish tyranny and against Greek and Serbian propaganda. At that time, no one, not even one of the leaders of the Macedonian liberation movement, asked the question, despite the struggle being fought for an autonomous Macedonia, whether the Macedonians are Bulgarians or not. That question did not exist at all. Naturally and casually, everyone considered themselves Macedonian Bulgarians. After this debunking, Poptomov wrote an amazing explanation of the Macedonian ethnogenesis, which was mentioned a little earlier. In this analysis, Poptomov makes a clear differentiation of Pirin Macedonia, where he wrote that its population was not nationally oppressed, and Vardar Macedonia, where the Macedonians were nationally oppressed under Serbian rule. Now, there's a narrative in Bulgaria, and even among some Macedonian Bulgarophiles, that the Macedonian nation is the result of Serbian occupation, and they're right, kind of. It's not in a way that they think. Of course, Serbian rule played a huge role in the Macedonian ethnogenesis. Of course, Serbs have their own quote-unquote guilt for the existence of the Macedonian nation. But when I see actual history professors claiming that the entire existence of ethnic Macedonians boils down to Serbian brainwashing, not occupation, brainwashing, which was carried out by Tito, who was a greater Serbian hegemonist, I get the urge to blow my brains out. That narrative is used to insult Macedonians, relegate them to a product of a psyop, and in general view the Macedonian nation as an error. If you follow this narrative, pay attention to the following Poptomov's words, cause it will make you appreciate the Macedonian nation and realize that Macedonians existing is a victory against Serbia, not of Serbia. Here are those words. In my opinion, it would be wrong to look for the beginning of the Macedonian national consciousness far in the past, for example, since the time of Tsar Samuel and the like. On such slippery ground, the scientific justification of the emerging Macedonian nation cannot be built. I think that real conditions for a certain, albeit still weak, separation of the Macedonians was created only after the Berlin Congress, which left Macedonia under Turkish yoke. The national liberation struggle of the Macedonian population under the leadership of Imro of Goce-Delchev was the second significant contribution to the individualization of Macedonians by creating a certain moral and political bond among them. The main, however, remarkable process of national differentiation took place in Vardar Macedonia, when the latter came under Greater Serbian rule and when its population was threatened with forcible Serbization. The effectiveness of the resistance against this violent Serbization forced the population in this part of Macedonia to lead the struggle no longer under the Bulgarian flag, but under a pure Macedonian flag. That gave certain advantages. In the Macedonian position, the population could defend itself more successfully and with greater reason against the Greater Serbian offensive. Here we must add the fact that it was during this period, 1912 to 1941, that a significant layer of the young Macedonian bourgeoisie was created, as well as a certain intelligentsia around it, which became the bearer of the Macedonian national idea. Here are the main roots of the Macedonian national identity in today's Vardar Macedonia. The fact that the backbone of the Macedonian national and state idea constitutes today the population of Vardar Macedonia, which earlier passed for Bulgarian, and the fact that the Serboman element there today is highly anti-Macedonian, which is confirmed in the report, it indicates precisely that the Macedonian national consciousness is really forged in the struggle mainly against the Greater Serbian assimilation. In the Pirin Macedonia, where the population was not subjected to national oppression in the narrow sense of the word, such a movement for Macedonian national separation could not develop and does not develop. Vladimir Poptomov wasn't the only one who criticized the Macedonians' historical views in the brochure. Criticism towards Macedonism also came from one of the biggest communist Bulgarians, Todor Pavlov. In 1946, he wrote a paper which he titled towards the question for the history of the Macedonian nation and for some historical falsifications. The inspiration for this piece of work was the already mentioned brochure by Vasily Ivanovski. Pavlov thought that Ivanovski's brochure had some good information, but was far from perfect because of the historical falsifications. You may remember from one of the recent videos that Ivanovski had a theory how the Macedonian and Bulgarian national revivals intertwined heavily, which Pavlov viewed as ridiculous, especially considering that Ivanovski admitted in his brochure that it was very difficult to find even the weakest tendencies for an independent Macedonian national revival during that time. Todor Pavlov explained it very simply. It's difficult to find such tendencies because they started to appear much later with individuals like Petar Poparsov, Teodosi Skopsky, and a few others. He then mentioned his father and grandfather who lived in Macedonia but had a Bulgarian conscience. Heck, Pavlov even called himself a Macedonian Bulgarian. Although he identified as a Macedonian-Bulgarian, he gave full support for the development of the Macedonian nation and culture, yet was still called a Greater Bulgarian chauvinist by some Macedonists. Why? Because he didn't want the Bulgarian identity of everyone from the Miladinov brothers to Kyosev to be denied. He viewed the Macedonian language as a Bulgarian dialect, and he wanted basic respect for Macedonians who still had a Bulgarian conscience. One specific part of Pavlov's writing I want to read is his great explanation of the Macedonian ethnogenesis. Listen to what he had to say. The truth is that until the beginning of the 19th century in Macedonia, we had various tribal consciousness, Brstyaks, Mijaks, and others, and a true national consciousness was born and developed as elsewhere on the basis of the capitalist productive exchange relations that began to develop throughout the Ottoman Empire. And because Bulgaria and Macedonia at that time, in the then Ottoman Empire, actually existed as a relatively complete economic, linguistic, folklore, and historical unit, it is not at all accidental that the early revival shaped the Macedonian Slavs, as well as all remaining Moesian, Thracian, and other Slavs. The general awareness that they belonged to the nationality for which the Macedonian Paisius wrote his history, with which the intensified crystallization and further development of the Bulgarian national consciousness began. The fact is, at that time, the competition was not between Bulgarian and Macedonian merchants, between Bulgarian and Macedonian bourgeoisie, but between the Bulgarian bourgeoisie in Bulgaria and Macedonia on one side, and the Greek and others on the other side. Later, after the liberation of Greece and Serbia, and especially after the liberation of Bulgaria, competition arose between the bourgeoisie of those countries and the bourgeoisie of Macedonia, which remained within the borders of the Ottoman Empire. In connection with that, and also on the basis of the chauvinist militaristic policy of Sofia, Belgrade, and Athens, to which policy the Exarchate also adapted, which at the time did not appear as a demiurge of the Bulgarian consciousness, but as its product. Subsequently, however, and especially after our liberation, it, together with the Vrhovist Macedonian organizations, became an organ of Bulgarian monarchism and bourgeoisie for a conscious implementation of their conquering policy in Macedonia and Thrace. The series of attempts to artificially provoke the uprisings in Macedonia at the behest of the Sofia Palace and Vrhovist cliques, the immeasurable suffering and sacrifices associated with these uprisings and battles, the defeat of the Ilinden uprising, the several catastrophes following the ill-fated wars of Sofia imperialists and chauvinists, the hideous internecine struggles among the Macedonian immigration and within Macedonia, and especially the treacheries, atrocities, and outrages of Ivan Mikhailov and other Verkhovist fascists. All this, together with the imperialist policy towards Macedonia of the great Western powers and also of Tsarist Russia, led the Macedonian patriots and also the Macedonian masses, especially the younger generations, to the idea that the way out of this situation could only be found in the creation of a new Macedonian nation, state, and culture, which would appear and develop further in alliance with all the Balkan progressive movements and also with the support of the world democratic factors. This process, the beginnings of which we have even before the liberation and which quickly matured after the liberation, gained gigantic dimensions and pace after the Ilinden uprising and especially during the First and most of all the Second World War. This ideological war between Macedonists and Bulgarian communists, at least within Bulgarian borders, would end in mid-1948 with a Bulgarian victory. During that time was the Informbiro period, a result of the Tito-Stalin split, which negated the Bulgarian-Yugoslav plan for unification laid in the Bled Agreement, and with that the plan to unify Pirin and Vardar Macedonia. Once Yugoslavia separated from the rest of the Eastern Bloc, the Bulgarian Communist Party removed the cultural autonomy Pirin Macedonia received after World War II. Anyone who complained about the removal was thrown in prison, and those people were pretty much all Macedonists, so Macedonism was killed off in Pirin Macedonia and Bulgaria in general. Now, I'm speculating a little, but considering that the Bulgarian Communist Party still recognized ethnic Macedonians in Pirin Macedonia for 10 years after the Tito-Stalin split, I believe that Bulgarian communists used Pirin Macedonia as a bait. The cultural autonomy, the tolerance of Macedonism, the recognition of the Macedonian nation in Pirin Macedonia until 1958, all of that was done in hopes that Yugoslav Macedonia would break away from Yugoslavia and unite with Pirin Macedonia within Bulgarian borders. That possibility did exist due to many Macedonians being very dissatisfied with the Titoist regime, and when such hope for unification existed, some amazing and sadly overlooked analyses of the Macedonian ethnogenesis were written. Let's take a look at books written by Dino Kyosev. He wasn't a random nobody. He was the one who explained to the Comintern the need to recognize a separate Macedonian nation back in 1933. In 1950, he released The Battles of the Macedonian People for Liberation, which was re-released a couple of years later. Kyosev wrote in his book that the Slavs of Macedonia were Bulgarians, but started to form into a separate Macedonian nation since 1878. There were many historical processes that made the Macedonian ethnogenesis happen, like the struggle against Turkish rule and the damaging influences that came from the outside, and over time, the movement for forming the Macedonian nation as a base for the Macedonian state grew enormously. Unfortunately, I can't go any in-depth because I couldn't find this book and instead got this information from a piece created by Professor Stoiko Stoikov and a handful of previews from Google Books. However, I can confidently assure those really were Dino Kyosev's views because he would repeat writing them in his 1954 book, History of the Macedonian National Revolutionary Movement. There was an entire chapter dedicated to the Macedonian ethnogenesis, which explained very well that the Slavs living in Macedonian and Bulgarian territory were fighting as a single group under Bulgarian church, schools, and language, but were divided in two. Firstly, the Berlin Treaty of 1878 has separated Macedonia and Bulgaria, and that territorial division put Macedonians in different living conditions from the ones in Bulgaria, which began the Macedonian nation forming. That forming became stronger when Imro was founded in 1893, and the Macedonian nation was already popular during the interwar period. In case you want to hear Kyosev's analysis in greater detail, I have an entire video where I read the specific chapter, only translated to English. Kyosev wasn't the only one who wrote on the Macedonian nation during 1950s. Another individual who did the same was Vladimir Poptomov. Like Kyosev, this man wasn't a random nobody. He was the creator of the very first primer of the standardized Macedonian language. Poptomov wrote 2 books about the Macedonians, however, neither of them were officially released. The first one was A Brief History of Macedonia. Don't be fooled by the word brief in the title. It contains a lot of stuff. Alexander the Great, Tsar Samuel, Petr Delyan, Bogomilism, the Miladinov brothers, you name it. Now, the book is not a Macedonist one. It may look like that at first glance because of the usage of the word Macedonian for the Middle Ages and the inclusion of pretty much everyone who has ever lived on Macedonian soil, but if you take a deeper look into what's written inside, it becomes clear that it's not falsifying history. I really like the approach taken by Vladimir Poptomov. He gave multiple proofs of Bulgarian character that was present in Macedonia back in the day, but still made clear that such historical fact should not be used to deny the existence of the newer Macedonian nation. He explained that Vardar Macedonia has all conditions for the development of the Macedonian nation. Matter of fact, Poptomov wrote that if Macedonia became an independent state back in 1912, a separate Macedonian nation would have still formed despite the presence of Bulgarian schools and language. He also compares Macedonians to Americans, in a sense that you have George Washington, who was an Englishman but worked for the creation of the American nation by fighting for an independent USA, and then you have Goce Delchev, a Macedonian Bulgarian who was a part in the Macedonian ethnogenesis because he fought for an autonomous Macedonia. This is yet another case of a Bulgarian communist realizing that the Macedonian nation formed, supporting that nation, and asking that the Bulgarian roots of that nation should not be forgotten or denied. Those views were written once again in his second book, Notes and Thoughts on the Macedonian Nation, which was apparently created little by little during the entire 1950s. It was a reaction to fabrications of the past and the anti-Bulgarian propaganda done by Macedonian Titoists, who after the Infobera period were in control of pretty much everything in Yugoslav Macedonia. Well, the book was a little all over the place, most likely because it was written throughout a long period of time. It had all the explanations that you have already heard. That the Macedonian nation didn't magically fall from the sky in 1944, that the Macedonian ethnogenesis was a result of many historical events like the Berlin Treaty, creation of Imro, and the tearing of Macedonia during the Balkan Wars, that the situation in Vardar Macedonia was different from the one in Pirin Macedonia, etc. I believe that by now you understand this historical viewpoint and why I like it very much. But if it's so great and objective, why isn't it that known to the general public? Well, basically, it was murdered. By 1958, Bulgaria stopped recognizing ethnic Macedonians in Pirin Macedonia, but the final nail in the recognition's coffin was the 1963 plenum of the Bulgarian Communist Party, where Bulgarian communists officially adopted a new viewpoint on the Macedonian nation, that one being that it's a creation of Tito and the Yugoslav Communist Party. It was a typical, you were Bulgarians until 1944, then Tito turned you into Macedonians. They adopted this viewpoint because the hope for Yugoslav Macedonia to break away from the rest of Yugoslavia was dead by then, hence why it was pointless to continue with recognizing ethnic Macedonians in Pirin Macedonia, However, they also wanted to cover up their mistakes. They admitted the past mistakes of the Bulgarian Communist Party on the Macedonian nation, and yes, there were mistakes made, and there are legitimate criticisms you can direct towards Bulgarian communists, yet Todor Zhivkov and his comrades decided to simply sweep those mistakes under the rug. That was the start of the Bulgarian Communist Party being totally dishonest with us, making false statements that they had nothing to do with the Macedonian nation building and how the Macedonian nation itself is just Tito's plot against Bulgaria. I think the best example is the poet Venko Markovsky. This man wrote songs and historical articles that deny Macedonians were ever Bulgarians, yet after his return to Bulgaria in 1965, he gave interviews and even wrote an entire book where he was all like, "I'm a big Bulgarian, Macedonia is the same as Bulgaria, the Bulgarian nation was invented by the Yugoslavs," you get the point. Then his wife jumped in and started attacking Vladimir for creating the Macedonian language, which doesn't make sense considering that Markovsky wrote in Macedonian years before Koneski. To add insult to injury, Tito actually liked this accusation being thrown at him because it meant him taking credit for giving Macedonians their own state, recognition, stopping Serbization, etc. Thankfully, many people in recent years, in particular Bulgarians, have realized that the Macedonian ethnogenesis is much more complex than what they were told. There is more than just Yugoslavs created Macedonians in 1944 or Macedonians are the oldest nation on the Balkans. I still stand by the view that the Macedonian nation began in 1878, skyrocketed in 1918, and was finalized in 1944, and there are many notable Macedonians and Bulgarians from the past that agreed with this historical viewpoint. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but we can't end this video without asking a very important question. Could this historiography have been implemented in Macedonia since the start? In other words, was it possible for this historiography to be official in Yugoslav Macedonia since 1944? Believe it or not, I would say yes. I'm fully aware that it would have been difficult to pull that off. The historiography talked about in this video would need to defeat Macedonia's historiography, defeat the anti-Bulgarian sentiment of Titoism, and it would need to be written in greater detail to the point where you can make history school books, but it could have been implemented back in 1944. How can I be sure about that? Because there already was a case like that in Yugoslavia. I have a video dedicated to the formation of the Montenegrin nation. If you watched it, you may remember a Montenegrin communist by the name Milovan Đilas in his article on how Montenegrins are Serbs by tribal traditions but have formed into a separate Montenegrin nation. Đilas didn't deny the Serbian origins of the Montenegrin nation, he just knew that, due to historical processes, such nation different to the Serbian nation was formed and should have a state of its own. On that video, I received many comments from my Bulgarian viewers who compared the Serb-Montenegrin situation to the Bulgarian-Macedonian one, and even stated how Macedonians should not deny their separation from Bulgarians the same way Montenegrins don't deny their separation from Serbs. What's funny is that this comparison isn't anything new. Kyosev gave the Montenegrin nation as an analogy in his book so he could explain the Bulgarian-Macedonian separatism easier. Same goes for Vladimir Poptomov, who not only mentioned Montenegrins, but Milovan Đilas as well. To quote Poptomov, "If Đilas can be proud of the past, of the history of his Montenegrins, making them the greatest Serbs of the past, and without fear of distorting the line of the Montenegrin nation," in one of his articles entitled "The Montenegrin Nation," placed in the newspaper Borba from 1948, stating that Montenegrins were at the time the vanguard of Serbdom and Montenegro the cradle of Serbian spiritual and political revival, Is it shameful for us Macedonians to recognize the historical past of the Macedonian people and their role in the work of the old Bulgarian revival? Unfortunately, when Gilas, with his own high-steamed pathos, thundered in the columns of Borba, declaring for all to hear what his brave Montenegrins were in the past, our Macedonians, who not only did not deign to this in defense of their heroic Macedonian people, but they lacked smart people who, on suggestion from outside, perhaps by Gilas himself, had the shamelessness to declare that there were never Bulgarians in Macedonia at all. What Gilas proudly and rightly claims for his Montenegrins, we Macedonians can claim for ourselves with even greater pride and with even greater right. Because what Montenegro gave to Serbia and Serbdom is nothing compared to what Macedonia gave to Bulgaria and Bulgariandom. Macedonia gave Bulgaria almost its entire history, and we Macedonians were left without a history, which is why Bulgarian history was also our history for centuries. We can think about the things that could have been and what should have been, and while it's important to know and remember the past, we have to look into what we can do today and make a better future. I know I sound like a wannabe philosopher, but my main point is all these things we're doing, all these discussions and work would be pointless if we didn't have hope for a brighter tomorrow. We can make a change, we can contribute to solving the decades-long disputes and reveal the truth that will be accepted by the following generations of Bulgarians and Macedonians. I would like to quote Vladimir Poptomov one more time. These are the words he wrote on May 24th, 1959, and they legit give me chills cause they sound prophetic. Let's make no illusions. New generations will come, the grandsons and granddaughters of the current leaders of the Republic of Macedonia, and they will speak in the language of history as it was. They will laugh at everything that is said and written today about Macedonia's past, at what is being done, especially at the effort to cover the Bulgarian name with mud, which was worn with pride and defended with streams of scarlet blood by the brightest figures of our glorious and unforgettable past. Thank you for watching. I hope this was worth the long wait and that you enjoyed this video. God bless and goodbye.
And I guess that's the we always see people fighting. I mean, you were on the what was that debate show, Samovistina on Kanal Pit on Channel 5. And I'm not specific on yours, but I watch debates on that channel from time to time. I find them fascinating what is being argued and what the topics are. But you're constantly seeing, you'll have a pro-Bulgarian guy and he's, citing the term Bulgarian that people say. Then the other person is the Macedonian, the ethnic Macedonian, says, no, but in this writing, he says Macedonian, as if those two had some sort of conflicting meaning at the time, where if you view it properly, I mean, there's, and you mentioned this before, I mean, there's a regional Macedonian identity that does have its distinguishing factors from other Bulgarians, but there is an underlying Bulgarian identity. And this was obviously, as we spoke about previously in the Exarchate, proven that they were all working towards one common project, one common national revival project. So I think a lot of times when we see the term Macedonian, Bulgarian, we like to view the differences between the two without realizing what the commonality was in those terms during that time period. And obviously today, those terms mean different things than they did back then. And I guess we can talk about this going forward on the separation of the Macedonian identity from the Bulgarian. Obviously, modern ethnic Macedonians today do not view themselves as part of a common Bulgarian ideal. So, when, according to you, did that split happen? Because this is often a common debate among people. Is, I guess there's multiple extremes here. On one extreme, like you mentioned, there's ethnic Macedonians who say we were never Bulgarian, we don't have any common history. And the other hand, you have Bulgarians who will say that Tito invented the Macedonians in 1945, which are two completely and equally absurd points of view, in my opinion. So, when, according to you, from the way you understand history and obviously nation building, the process of nation building, at what point in time is it legitimate to speak of a separate Macedonian nation? When did that, and it's probably not going to be a certain date or a certain period, but or a certain specific period of time, but how does that process work from what you've read, from what you've seen?
So, and I think more and more historians tend to, so going through again this book, which one of the many sources, but I came recently across it, and I thought it was a really fascinating study. And I looked at the most up to date because this is more or less incorporating most modern day theories. And it's also written 13 years after independent Macedonia. Mm-hmm. So this was sort of in Macedonian historiography, in your face, kind of an approach. And so looking at, there's no indication that any nation building was happening before the Balkan Wars. Now, Balkan Wars meant the end of the Exarchate. And so I had a couple of actually quotes, but I didn't translate them. In that period after the Serbian rule and the Greek rule entered into Aegean and the Varder Macedonia. And so what we're seeing during this period, Kirill, is this process, this difficult and slow process by which basically the next generations were a lot worse off than the previous in terms of education. They were forced to go to learn Serbian into Serbian schools. Many of them chose not to resist it because they had voluntarily bought into one type of education system which was completely removed from them. And so they were not really open to the idea of accepting whether, particularly in Aegean Macedonia, this was very painful because they did not want to buy into the Greek. They didn't understand the language. They felt it, and they felt compelled to learn the language. In Macedonia, Varder, it was a little bit easier because they could understand Serbian, but they never accepted it as their own, and particularly the grammar is difficult for them,
Right.
And so, in my understanding, you had by 1930s and 40s, you already had a clear idea that the distribution of power was not such that favored Bulgaria and was not such that favored the reinstallment of the Exarchate and the Bulgarian cultural tradition. And you already had a generation. Now remember, this 0 to 20 years basically that were at that time probably about 35-40% of the demographics, that had already grown without any ties to the Exarchate, without any memory of historical narrative, with an attempt to be forcefully assimilated into Serbian ethnicity, and with their refusal, their resistance to do that, And so I think this generation was the one that first embraced the idea of Macedonism as the third way. And I think Tito and the Comintern, including the Bulgarian communists, accepted that out of the idea that basically, hey, we can't solve that problem by reintegrating this territory into Bulgaria. So they're not Serbs. They just don't want to be one. So let's go for the third way, which is Macedonians. Now, they do the same thing in Thrace and in Dobruja. It never worked in Thrace and in Dobruja. Well, it never worked because in Dobruja, basically what happened is with the Craiova agreement, Bulgaria gained access of southern Dobruja back, and
Right.
all of the Bulgarian population in ethnic Dobruja, about 100,000 people, 60, 70,000 people was basically exchanged, was moved into Dobruja, and all the about 100,000 Romanians were pushed out into Romania. So it was ethnically cleansed. In northern in Thrace, the Pomaks were the only ones who remained, about 50,000 population in this area of Xanthi, but they never affiliated strong bond because of the religion. They're Muslims,
Right.
and many of them even associated with Islam, even though they were Slavic speaking, hence Bulgarian. The rest pretty much were moved into Bulgaria proper and then of course the Adrianople area was ethnically cleansed in 1913. So there was, there were maybe some families that chose to stay there, but they chose to stay under the condition of assimilation, accepting the new culture. And so that's why nation building project never happened there. In Macedonia was the only place where a nation building project could have occurred. And yes, I think actually here I look at the communists and say they were not so bad actually. They tried to fix a problem through sort of a new idea. Problem with the communist Kirill is that they can't fix anything because they do everything by force, and that's what we saw: nation building by force, not only in Macedonia and former Yugoslavia, but also in Soviet Union, and that's what we have.